The ballroom of the Chateau Bellerive had never looked more cruel. Garlands of white orchids draped from the ceiling in perfect arches, and the chandeliers, 3 of them, each the size of a small car, threw golden light across spent the last hour sipping Moet and congratulating themselves on being invited. Outside, the St. Lawrence glittered in the late September sun. Inside, everything smelled of money and something uglier underneath it. Tobias Wren stood at the center of it all, adjusting his cufflinks for the 4th time that evening. He was not a man who needed to adjust his cufflinks. He was the kind of man who had people for that. But tonight, there was something almost electric in the way he moved through the room, shaking hands, laughing just a half-second too long at things that weren't funny, steering his new fiancée Camille toward the cameras whenever one appeared. He was performing. Everyone in that room could feel it, even if they couldn't name it. What they didn't know, what almost no one in that ballroom knew, was that Tobias had sent a very specific invitation 3 weeks ago. Not to a business contact, not to an old friend, to his ex-wife. Her name was Josephine Wren, though she hadn't used that last name in 2 years. She'd gone back to her maiden name the week the divorce was finalized. Josephine Aldecoa, 38 years old, former marketing director at Pemberton & Associates, mother of twin girls, 7 years old, named Rosie and June, currently living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Verdun, working freelance contracts that barely covered the rent, because her ex-husband's lawyers had been very thorough, and the settlement had been designed not to provide but to humiliate. She had not asked to be invited, but Tobias had sent the invitation anyway, on heavy cream cardstock with gold-embossed lettering, addressed specifically to Josephine Aldecoa, with a handwritten note on the back, in his precise architectural script. Thought you should see what you walked away from. Dress accordingly. T. He'd sent it because he wanted an audience. He'd sent it because 2 years of Josephine managing with quiet dignity had begun to feel, to him, like a personal insult. A woman who was supposed to be broken was not breaking. A woman who was supposed to be desperate had not once called him for money, had not once appeared on his social media, had not once given him the satisfaction of knowing she was suffering, and Tobias Wren was a man who needed to know things like that. So he invited her. To the engagement party. To the Chateau Bellerive. To the room full of people who had once been their shared friends, and were now, politely, his. His plan was simple, and he'd thought about it the way he thought about everything. Methodically, thoroughly, with a great deal of satisfaction. She would come, because not coming would feel like defeat, and Josephine had never been good at retreat. She would come wearing something that cost too little for this room. She would come alone, because who did she have? She would smile too hard and stand too straight, and eventually, someone would ask her what she was doing these days, and she would have to answer, and the answer would be freelance work. Actually, just keeping busy, and the room would understand in the way that rooms understand things. Quietly, collectively, without a word being said. He had told Camille about the invitation on a Thursday night over dinner at a restaurant he owned a stake in. Camille Beaufort-Lying had listened with the careful expression of a woman who had learned that Tobias's cruelties were best received with a thin smile and a glass of Malbec. She was 31 and stunning in the precise, geometric way that certain women from certain Montreal families could be: angular jaw, dark hair pulled back so tight it changed the shape of her face, eyes that assessed everything and gave nothing away. "That's a little cold," she'd said. "It's honest," Tobias had replied. "She should know where she stands." Camille had nodded and said nothing else, and Tobias had taken her silence for agreement. Because that was another thing he did, he took silence for agreement. What he did not know, because he had stopped paying attention to Josephine the moment the divorce papers were signed, was what had happened in the 22 months since. Josephine almost didn't open the envelope. It arrived on a Tuesday in late August, sandwiched between a Hydro-Quebec bill and a flyer for a new Thai place on Wellington. She recognized the handwriting before she even turned it over. That precise architectural script. She'd spent 10 years watching it sign things, contracts, Christmas cards, the paperwork that dismantled their life together. She set it on the kitchen counter and made coffee first. Rosie and June were at school. The apartment was quiet in the particular way that small apartments are quiet when children aren't in them. full of small sounds that you'd never notice otherwise. The hum of the refrigerator, the upstairs neighbor's footsteps, the faint noise of the street below. Josephine stood at the counter with her coffee and looked at the envelope for a long time. Then she opened it. She read it twice, set it down, picked it up, and read it once more. Then she did something that surprised her. She laughed. Not a bitter laugh, not the performance of someone trying to convince themselves they're above it. A real laugh, the kind that starts in the chest. Because the note was so perfectly, transparently Tobias. The condescension dressed as generosity, the cruelty wrapped in an invitation, that it almost read like a parody of itself. Thought you should see what you walked away from. She hadn't walked away. She had been pushed. But there was no point in correcting a man who had already written his own version of history in permanent ink. She put the invitation on the kitchen counter and left it there for 4 days. She told herself she wasn't going. She told her sister Renata she wasn't going. She told her best friend Pippa over the phone one night while the girls slept that she absolutely, definitively was not going. "You're going," Pippa said. "I'm not. Joe, you already know what you're going to wear." There was a pause. "I might know what I'd wear," Josephine said. "Hypothetically, go," Pippa said. "Just go. And let them see you." The thing was, and this was the part Josephine hadn't told anyone yet, not Renata, not Pippa, not her mother, the thing was that she had something now. Something real, something she'd built in the wreckage of the last 2 years, and it had changed the shape of everything. It had started with the contract she'd picked up 18 months ago from a small, sustainable packaging company called Norland Green. A referral from an old colleague. Nothing glamorous, 6 weeks of brand strategy work that she'd done from her kitchen table, while Rosie and June watched cartoons on the weekend. The work was good, and the CEO, a quiet, precise man named Everett Hollis, had noticed. He'd asked if she was available for a second project. Then a third. Everett Hollis was 44 years old, self-made, private to the point of being almost invisible in the city's business press, despite the fact that Norland Green had grown, in the 3 years since he'd acquired it, into something that occupied a very interesting position at the intersection of materials science and consumer goods. He had a daughter who was 9. He had been divorced for 5 years and had, he said once over coffee after a late strategy session, become extremely good at being alone. "That doesn't sound like a compliment to yourself," Josephine had said. "It's not," he'd said, "but it's true." They had not started as anything other than professional. She had been scrupulously careful about that, because she was working for his company, and because her capacity for trust had been reduced, by Tobias, to something that needed to be rebuilt very slowly from scratch. But Everett was patient in a way she wasn't used to, not performatively patient, not a man making a show of giving her space, just genuinely unbothered by pace. He called when he said he would. He showed up when he said he would. He did not say things he didn't mean. By March, she was no longer just his consultant. By July, they had told the girls, who had received the information with the practical equanimity of 7-year-olds who had more urgent concerns, specifically whether Everett's house had a yard, and whether his daughter Margot would want to share the switch. Both answers were yes. When Tobias's invitation arrived in August, Everett had been the first person she actually showed it to, because the nature of their relationship by then was that he was the person she showed things to. He'd read it and set it down on the kitchen table, the same counter where she'd left it for 4 days, with a very contained expression. "What do you want to do?" he'd asked. "I don't know yet," she'd said. "Okay," he'd said. And that was it. No steering, no performance of outrage on her behalf, no telling her what she should or shouldn't feel. Just okay. That was when she knew she was going. The night of the party, Everett drove. He had not suggested this. Josephine had asked because asking Everett for things had become, gradually, something she was relearning how to do. He'd said yes before she finished the sentence. They had arranged for Rosie and June to stay at Renata's for the night. Everett's daughter Margot was with her mother for the week. The apartment had that quiet again, but this time it didn't feel like absence. It felt like the held breath before something. Josephine wore the dress she'd hypothetically identified to Pippa 6 weeks earlier. It was the deep green of a forest just after rain, long, with a structured bodice and a back that dipped lower than she'd worn anything in years. She had bought it not for this party specifically but for herself. In the January of the year, she'd decided to stop shrinking. She'd worn it once, to a dinner she and Everett had attended in the spring. And a woman she didn't know had stopped her in the coat room to ask where it was from. She did her own hair. She did her own makeup with the particular focus of a woman who has learned to take her time on herself, not as vanity, but as ceremony. She was not trying to look like someone who had survived. She was simply trying to look like herself. But herself these days was someone very different from the woman who had signed those divorce papers. Everett was waiting in the kitchen when she came out. He was wearing a dark suit, no tie, and he looked up from his phone with the expression she'd come to recognize. Quiet, specific, entirely for her. "Ready?" he said. "Let me get my coat," she said. He drove, and they didn't talk much, which was fine. The kind of silence between two people who have said enough that silence is no longer uncomfortable. The lights of the city moved past the windows of his car, a black Escalade understated, Canadian, winter practical, and Josephine watched them without really seeing them. "You know," she said somewhere on the Champlain, "he sent that invitation to make me feel small." "I know," Everett said. "I want you to know that I'm not going for him. I know that too." She looked at him. He was watching the road. "I'm going for me," she said. "I just wanted to say it out loud." He nodded once. "Then let's go." The valet at Chateau Bellerive took the car and didn't blink, because valets at places like this were trained not to blink. But Josephine noticed the particular way the young man's posture adjusted as Everett stepped out and buttoned his jacket. There was something about Everett Hollis in a room, not loudness, not performance, not the practiced dominance of men like Tobias who had learned to take up space as a strategy. It was more like density, like the room registered his presence before anyone had consciously noticed him. They walked in together. The woman at the guest registration table had a list and a practiced smile, and she scanned it efficiently until she found Aldecoa. Josephine and her smile did something complicated. She looked up at Josephine, then at Everett, then back at the list. "Of course, Miss Aldecoa," she said. "Welcome." They walked into the ballroom. Josephine felt the room before she saw the individual faces. The way sound changes when you enter a space, and the space notices you. Conversations continuing but at a slightly altered frequency, like a radio station drifting 1 degree. Heads turning with the particular choreography of people trying not to appear to be looking while absolutely looking. She saw Harriet Dawes first, an old friend, technically, though the word friend had been tested thoroughly by the divorce, and found to be, in Harriet's case, conditional. Harriet was standing with a group near the Champagne Tower, and she looked at Josephine, and something moved across her face too fast to name. She saw Marcus Earlwood, who had been their couple's therapist for a year before the divorce, and who was here, apparently, as a personal guest of Tobias's, which said a great deal about the therapeutic relationship. She saw Tobias. He was across the room, facing the opposite direction, laughing at something with his hand on the arm of a man in a gray suit. The new fiancée, Camille, was beside him, holding a glass of champagne with both hands, and for just a moment, when Camille's eyes found Josephine across the room, there was something in them that was not what Tobias had probably predicted. It was not contempt. It was not triumph. It was something closer to recognition. Then Tobias turned. The room later was divided on how to describe what happened on his face in that first second. Some people said he looked confused. Some said he looked like a man who had done a calculation that came back wrong. Harriet Dawes said, to several people in the days that followed, that he looked afraid, and Harriet was usually right about faces even when she was wrong about people. What Josephine saw was simpler. She saw him understand that the evening was not going to go the way he'd planned it. She had walked in a forest green dress with a man who had, 6 months ago, been quietly named to the board of one of the largest clean materials companies in the country. She had walked in with her head at an angle that was not quite proud and not quite defiant, but was entirely, specifically her own. She had walked in as Josephine Aldecoa, who had spent 2 years rebuilding something out of wreckage, and who had arrived tonight not to compete or to retaliate or to prove anything to the man across the room, but simply to exist in full, to take up the space she was owed, to be seen by the people who had politely looked away. She walked to the bar. She ordered sparkling water, not because she didn't drink, but because she wanted her head absolutely clear. And she turned to face the room, and the room, piece by piece, came to her. What happened over the next 2 hours was not dramatic. Exactly. There were no confrontations, no speeches, no moment where Tobias said something terrible in front of witnesses, and she delivered a perfectly timed response. Real life doesn't work that way, and Josephine had long since stopped waiting for the cinematic version of justice. What happened was subtler, and in some ways more complete. Giles Okonkwo, who ran the investment arm of a very old Montreal family office and who had been at their wedding, materialized at her elbow within 10 minutes. He had heard of Norland Green, of course he had. His firm had been looking at the sector. Could he get Everett's card? They spent 20 minutes talking in a way that had nothing to do with Tobias Wren at all, and Tobias could see them from across the room. And he knew enough about Giles Okonkwo's firm to know exactly what that conversation meant. Pippa, who had been explicitly not invited but had been Camille's colleague 3 years ago and had shown up as her +1, appeared at Josephine's side sometime around 9 o'clock, with a glass of wine and the specific expression of someone trying very hard not to look delighted. "How are you doing?" she said, in the careful tone of a woman conducting a real-time welfare check. "I'm good," Josephine said. And then, more quietly, "I'm actually good, Pip." Pippa looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at Everett, who was talking to Giles Okonkwo with the even, unhurried manner of a man who had nowhere else to be. "Yeah," Pippa said. "Yeah, you are." The moment with Camille was the one she hadn't expected. It was near the end of the evening. Everett had been pulled into a conversation near the windows, and Josephine had stepped to the edge of the room for a moment of quiet, and Camille appeared beside her with 2 glasses of champagne and held one out. Josephine took it. They stood for a moment without speaking. The room hummed ahead of them. Tobias was near the center of it, still performing, but the energy around him had changed in the way that energy does when the audience has quietly made up their minds. "He told me you'd show up looking defeated," Camille said. "Not meanly. More the way you repeat a weather forecast that turned out to be wrong." Josephine considered that. "He was always more interested in his predictions than in the actual evidence," she said. Camille was quiet for a moment. "Then I'm starting to see that." Josephine looked at her, really looked, the way you look at someone when you're deciding what they are to you. Camille was not a villain, she thought. Camille was a woman who had believed a particular story about a particular man, and was, tonight, receiving new information. What she did with it was not Josephine's concern, but she was not without sympathy. "For what it's worth," Josephine said, "I'm not here for him. I came for myself." Camille nodded slowly. "I can tell." She walked back into the party. Josephine watched her go and thought, she's going to figure it out, one way or another. The same way all women eventually figure out men like Tobias Wren. Either before or after the cost is too high. They left at 10:30. The valet brought the car and Everett held the door, which he always did, not as performance but as reflex, the small physical language of a man who had been raised to notice people. Josephine settled into the passenger seat and the door closed, and for a moment the sounds of the Chateau Bellerive disappeared entirely. The music, the voices, the specific acoustics of expensive people in an expensive room, and there was just the car and the night and the lights of Montreal beginning to appear as they pulled onto the road. "Okay?" Everett said. "Okay," she said. He drove. She let herself breathe. She thought about Tobias inside, recalibrating, revising, conducting the mental inventory of an evening that had not gone as engineered. She thought about his note. "Thought you should see what you walked away from," and how it had been designed to land like a verdict, and how the thing about verdicts was that they required you to accept the court's authority. She had simply declined to appear in that particular proceeding. Tonight was not his courtroom. Tonight was just a Tuesday in September at a hotel on the St. Lawrence, and she was 38 years old and she had 2 daughters, who called her on the drive home from school every day, and a man beside her who had never once made her feel like a problem to be managed. "Rosie called at 8:30, she said. "Did I tell you? From Renata's. She wanted to know if we were going to get a dog." Everett's mouth shifted towards something. "What did you say?" "I said we'd talk about it. That's either a yes or a very delayed no." "I know," she said. "I think it might be a yes." The city moved past them, lit up and alive, indifferent to the small private victories of ordinary nights. Josephine watched it and felt, for the first time in a long time, the uncomplicated pleasure of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Not arrived, not vindicated, not restored to anything, just present. Just herself. Just Josephine Aldecoa, going home.